Good morning, good day, good evening to you all. Welcome to our final webinar before COP30. This is our final sprint, and we're very glad that you're able to join today. If you have a moment, you could introduce yourselves in the chat. It would be lovely to hear where you're listening in from, and just to say that anybody can save the conversation in the chat today. So there will be lots of links shared in the chat, and there may be interesting resources shared, and you're welcome to save the chat for your own reference. We're providing interpretation today, thanks to our wonderful team of interpreters from Tinta. And you can find Spanish, Portuguese, French, and Bahasa Indonesia if you go under the 3 dots and then to interpretation. You can choose your language channel, and the main channel will be in English today. And we are recording today's call as we record all of the groundwork webinars, and we will be sharing that on our YouTube channel, and the presentations are shared already in our Google Drive. I will just share the link with you now. And then you can have the presentation yourself, also in the language that you require. So you will find the presentations under that link. I think we may well still have a few people joining, so welcome. Good morning, good day, good evening. It's great to have you here on this final webinar from the groundwork team before COP30. Just to introduce myself and the others on the team, my name is Philippa Bailey. I'm an independent consultant with Groundwork and also connected to the International Climate Politics Hub, which is an international diplomatic network pushing for high ambition in the UNFCCC processes. And my colleague in Groundwork is Paula Alvarado, who today is in the background, but monitoring and supporting with the chat. Paula, if you want to open your camera, just say hello. That's Paula. And we're also supported by the amazing team from Tinta, and funding for this project comes from the Food and Nature Climate Dialogue, Julia Zanoli and Anna Alvarado, our colleagues there. And the Groundwork project is about providing actionable policy insights for Indigenous leaders, their teams and allies in the run-up to the major climate moments of the year. We try to take the latest policy intelligence from the International Climate Politics Hub and align that with Indigenous peoples and local community priorities. We mostly deliver these online briefing sessions and some written materials, but there's also the possibility for tailored support if you've got specific issues or regional perspectives that you want to see represented. Please do get in touch with us. In terms of what we'll be covering today, I'm going to do a little bit of setting the scene for COP30, just in terms of some of the major themes that are shaping this event. We'll hear some reflections from Edson Krenak from Brazil, who is Cultural Survival's Brazil lead. And then I will talk a little bit more about how we bridge the gaps in climate action, or how those gaps, how COP30 is going to try and bridge those gaps this year. And then we are lucky to be joined by Basiru Isa from REPALEAC in Central Africa, and he and possibly leaders from AMAN as well will speak about their priorities for COP30 and what they hope to see this meeting achieve. So in terms of setting the scene for COP30, COP30 begins actually next week already on Thursday and Friday with the World Leaders Summit in Belém in the state of Pará in Brazil. But the COP negotiations themselves start on Monday, the 10th of November and run through till the 21st. This COP is significant because it's 10 years since the Paris Agreement. And as you all know, that was a major turning point in the climate negotiations that first referenced a legally binding temperature limit. So that the limit of 2 degrees to pursue efforts to limit the increase to 1.5 degrees. And that's still the framework that we are working within now. So the last 10 years have really been about negotiating the specific terms of the agreement under each article of the Paris Agreement. And that is now largely complete. This year also sees the beginning of a new cycle of nationally determined contributions. So this is part of the Paris mechanism and is what is known as the ratchet. So the idea is that you can only go forward, you can only have greater ambition in your targets. So in the nationally determined contributions, this is where countries get to define their own targets for greenhouse gas emissions. And they do this on a 5-yearly basis. So where the yellow arrow is now, we're coming to the 3rd cycle of those nationally determined contributions. And as I say, pushing all the time for the highest level of ambition. The global stocktake is the process that assesses how far have we come towards achieving those goals. Another feature of the COP30 this year is, if you can go to the next slide, Axel, is the support for multilateralism. And this is really, really important because a lot of people are questioning, and in the world at large, people are questioning the value of our big multilateral institutions. And that's particularly as the US withdraws its support for not just for the UNFCCC, but in other multilateral spaces, important multilateral spaces. So, but what the Brazil presidency have seen this year and what we have observed is that there's still a lot of support for multilateral climate action. And indeed, it's the only way forward. Another feature of this year is the sort of unique quality of the Brazilian presidency. So they've really gone for it with high levels of engagement and a lot of different initiatives, a lot of emphasis on what is called the action agenda, which are the non-state actors, so civil society actors, business, industry, subnational governments, and seeing that as being a big vehicle to deliver the ambitions of the meeting. You will have heard about the People's Circle, led by Minister Sonia Guajajara from the Ministry of Indigenous Peoples. And that has led to the International Indigenous Commission and also the International Commission of Traditional Communities, Afro-Descendants and Family Farmers. The Brazil presidency has also spoken a lot about this concept of the mutirão, which, as I understand, is an indigenous concept from the Tupi and Guarani people of an effort, a self-organized effort to support one another in times of need. And it's this idea that we all need to come together to achieve the goals of COP30. And while this is all very, very positive, it is still a little bit unclear from a political point of view exactly how the COP package is going to land. So how are the negotiations going to land? And that really needs to be steered by the presidency, and what is known as the landing ground for those negotiations needs to be set up in advance so that countries are prepared and understand where they are going to need to make concessions and compromises. And for that process to work, it's needed. You need to have strong leadership of all of the different thematic areas of the COP negotiations. So I think if there's a criticism of Brazil, it's that there has been a lot of amazing activity, but the absolute clarity on what needs to land in the negotiations has been a little bit less clear. Finally, and very importantly in the context of our meeting today, COP30 will see the largest ever Indigenous local community and Afro-descendant presence at a COP. So that it's hoped that both within the blue zone, within the central negotiation area of the COP, there will be up to 3 times as many Indigenous delegates as there have been before. And outside the blue zone, so in the green zone and in the Indigenous COP itself, and in many other spaces around the city, there may be a delegation of up to 3,000 or even more people. So that's something like 10 times as many Indigenous representatives as we have seen at any previous COP. So I'd like to just pause there and hand over to Edson Krenak from Cultural Survival. As I mentioned, he is the Brazil country lead. And Edson, if you want to share your slides and your thoughts about how Brazil is meeting this moment of the COP30.
Thank you very much, Filipa. Good morning. Bom dia, good afternoon, boa tarde to everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you for the invite. Yes, I have the honor to share some perspectives, especially from Indigenous peoples, and I prepared some slides to illustrate my points, and I'm going to share with you. I believe you can see it now, right? Perfect. Well, I worked for almost 6 years for Cultural Survival as Brazil lead, as already shared. Working in Cultural Survival, we are a global organization supporting Indigenous peoples all over the world. In Brazil, we have been also working with the Quilombola, the Afro-descendant traditional communities. Also, I work with Surge Coalition. The Surge stands for Securing Indigenous People's Rights in the Green Economy. And the photos you see here, you see Mashakali people on the right in their agroforest project. And on the left, you see an image from a community dialogue. It was international actually gathering we had in last February, where communities impacted by lithium extraction from Chile, Argentina, Bolivia, and Brazil, Indigenous and Quilombola people gather to discuss what their territories are in this context of a green economy, just transition, and also preparing for COP discussions. Actually, our experiences, I would like to before sharing that, I wanted to share some numbers and some reality for you about Quilombola and Indigenous peoples in Brazil. Brazil has a particular take on local community because perhaps I don't really know any other country in the world that has a very clear, Filipa, you were talking about the clarity, but about this topic, defining who are local communities, traditional communities. Brazil has a really good example and clarity about defining who they are, where they live. And one of them are the Quilombola communities. Quilombola people are Afro-descendants, but not only just Black people. They are communities that live and keep their traditions back into from their ancestors, from the African tribes, etc. They have a particular livelihood, very, very close to indigenous peoples. Many areas, they even overlap territories. They are partners. Recently, I talked to some of the Quilombola leaders with indigenous leaders. They even shared a little bit about their radical hospitality to challenge or to face the climate change affecting all of them. Unfortunately, even though they are very strong in their traditions, in their cultures, they face similar challenge of indigenous peoples. You can see the last two numbers here. Only 12%, around 12% of Quilombola people live in demarcated territories. The rest, they live in total vulnerability, abandoned by the state in terms of securing their protection and territorial rights. This second map is about indigenous peoples. In Brazil, we are really more than 300 people speaking more than 200 languages. And we, unfortunately, even though Brazil is like large biomes with large forests, like the Amazon rainforest, important critical biome for these COPs particularly, unfortunately, the guardians of these biomes, the guardians of the forest, they face the number 61% of them, they live outside of demarcated indigenous land, facing the same vulnerability, climate impact, insecurity, juridical insecurity, no access to water, to education, to proper information, to secure their rights and to be involved in this space. Then, even though we are going to have this huge, massive participation of indigenous peoples, most of them being there, they are coming not to celebrate the COP in the Amazon, but also to criticize the COP in the Amazon, because the COP in the Amazon is happening in a context of human rights violations, land violations, not only climate change impact on their lands. The Amazon rainforest has been facing the last years, 10, 20 years, the most severe droughts in history. And these communities in the forest, they are facing, they are forced to migrate because of that. They don't have access to resources. Then, if you compare, for example, other sectors in Brazilian society, like the huge soy agribusiness, beef, mining, development projects in these biomes. I will take example, for example, this 700% deforestation increase in the last 30 years associated with these activities are happening in the Amazon rainforest and the Cerrado biome, two key biomes that are key important for the climate solutions, and where most of these people, indigenous peoples and local communities live. In spite of that, if you see Brazil, indigenous lands in Brazil, they represent 30% of the territory. Because of this lack of legal security and protection, they still are able to face deforestation, but to decrease, to keep a very, very, very low number. And they are responsible to protect 20% of native forests that are left, they exist for more than 500 years, considering the colonial times in the last 5 centuries. And this is the critical contrast between what are the Brazil government activities impacting these peoples and what these peoples are still able to do. And you know, taking a look, you already mentioned the NDC, this taking a look of what the countries are presenting and what indigenous peoples and local communities are presenting in Brazil. Even that NDC, part of these numbers are hypothetical based on their advocacy work, their documentation they are sharing through their representative organizations. the focus of the indigenous peoples has been not only discussing numbers and designing beautiful policies, but really real concrete solutions. These numbers show how they are much more sharper in terms of approaching the problems. I will skip this one here to not take too much time, but I go to the next slides. This is another picture from the people, indigenous peoples and Quilombola people from the Jequitinhonha Valley, where they are facing the lithium extraction, receiving I could say that I cannot even compute how much money comparing to what they are receiving. Mining companies and development projects impacting environment, impacting these people are receiving funds for climate funds much more than these communities, just for you to have an idea. And these are the focus of the indigenous peoples and the Quilombola community NDCs. They have prepared their own NDCs. Why they prepare their own NDCs? Because the countries are failing to really incorporate indigenous peoples and local communities in these policies. They are failing to implement the importance already. This text here comes from the UN FCCC documents. The importance of strengthening climate action through integration of traditional, indigenous, and local knowledge. And this, even Brazil is failing to do that. We have a ministry, we have indigenous peoples really occupying many space, but unfortunately, what we have gathered from their NDC. So we can see here the just a summary from indigenous peoples NDC. You can find this document in the APIB website, and the Quilombola NDC document also from the CONAC website, the organization that represents these people. I will not read line by line, box by box, but what we see here is a diagnosis that these people, even though their critical role in fighting climate change, they are also facing the same vulnerability of no legal protection, no funds to deal with mitigation, no funds to protect their territories, no resources to really conduct autonomous and governance measures. They are facing several violations of their rights, like FPIC, consultation, etc. The main priorities of indigenous peoples and local communities in Brazil, taking especially from Quilombola communities, is to see these discussions about the fund that's going to be launched in the COP, the Tropical Forest Forever, the triple F here, mitigation, all these policies, they wanted to encapsulate in one single policy, which is to ensure territorial governance and protection. They want demarcation, and demarcation rights to be protected and guaranteed by the authorities. They are also dialoguing with development sector, industry, investors, etc., to focus not only in mitigation, but to responsibility, to integrate more actors in this proposal, not coming from top-down measures or implementation measures, but really involve them. And how these indigenous peoples and local communities are proposing things to a stronger FPIC compliance for all financed activities, all investments, all activities related or not to climate must have a very robust FPIC. The second is to implement, really not to suspend like is happening to the soy moratorium. It was a proposal from IPLC people a decade ago to trace the soy and all the products coming from the forest. But now the industry is suspending this moratorium. There is no possibility to really implement these diligence laws. if we don't have moratorium, if you don't have any mechanism to protect the forests. And finally, to support indigenous-led climate finance mechanisms, the finance direct access start with planning with indigenous people. You cannot plan up there, top there, and then put down as they were just recipients. They wanted to be part of the planning as well. And finally, to conclude this part, there's no just transition in this COP. I know going to be a huge discussion, just transition minerals. There will be a pavilion related to that. But this has to happen without sacrifice zones. There is a huge silence about the amount of extraction in the name of a green economy. The indigenous peoples, local communities are advocate for territories as a climate solution. They are not only stakeholders in this situation, they are right holders, they are knowledge holders. They can have a much more decisive participation. We are afraid that this mutirão, this crowd work the government is ambitiously proposing, gonna be only something very superficial if we don't have indigenous people and local communities in the key moments of the negotiations and decision-making processes. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Edson. I think you raised so many important points there that people are coming to COP to criticize and to campaign about the things that they're lacking, the fundamental land rights, the security, the self-determination, the protection with FPIC, and other policies. I would reference people that we've held several webinars about transition minerals featuring some of Edson's colleagues, and you can find all of that material on the Groundwork website. I think this question about land demarcation is so important, and maybe we can just go into that a little bit now, because as one of the contributors to the chat says, that Brazil's NDC does not include indigenous land demarcation as a measurable strategy. I think it mentions it, but not in a concrete way. And you spoke today about the indigenous NDC put together by APIB and the Quilombola NDC, you know, encapsulating their vision. How do indigenous peoples and traditional communities impact the Brazilian NDC so that it better represents the importance of land demarcation for them as a strategy?
Well, thank you for the question, Larissa. It's a clear failure again of how Brazil is aiming to implement that. Brazil doesn't want to compromise with other projects. They just passed the oil drilling in the source of the Amazon rainforest, and there are many other permits. The Brazil's Congress, not only the government, the Lula presidency, but even the Brazil's Congress is dismantling all the security, environmental laws, and also try to move on with the Marco Temporal, another the temporal frame bill to undermine indigenous people's ability to move on demarcation lands as a climate solution. This is going to be the main message, the main negotiation topic. If we can if you can negotiate any other point, we will, but demarcation land we cannot negotiate. This is no negotiable.
Yeah. Yeah, thank you so much. And we will come back to discussing this, I think, with Basiru Isa from REPALEAC and Eustobio from AMAN. I'm going to move on a little bit with some of the areas where this COP is attempting to bridge the gaps. You know, Edson has highlighted how compromised Brazil is as a country in terms of you know, on the one hand, wanting to acknowledge the contribution of Indigenous peoples and local communities, on the other hand, pursuing economic growth and oil exploration and other revenue generating schemes with the idea of lifting people out of poverty, but also contributing further to climate change, unfortunately. So there's a very interesting position that Brazil is taking of sort of speaking with two mouths, maybe, if that's, I hope that's not offensive to say. But the COP30 in general, you know, and it is the international community coming together, needs to confront the gap between the climate reality that we're seeing unfolding around us and the response that we're making. So there's a huge gap in the severity of the situation and the way that we're responding to that. We keep hearing that this is a COP of implementation. As I said, the negotiations on the legal texts are largely done, and this is the point where we need to be showing that the decisions translate into action in the world. And it can't just be that we build one bridge in one area that is easier to tackle than others. It's everything has to go together, because when we talk about mitigation, so that's reducing greenhouse gas emissions to make climate change less severe, or we're talking about adaptation of how we live in a warming planet. If we're talking about loss and damage, which is how we compensate for the losses that cannot be adapted to, and we're talking about finance, if any one of these is blocked, it holds the others up. And that is particularly true for finance, because finance is unfortunately the unlocking of all of the other pathways forward. So we've spoken a little bit about the Brazil kind of approach in their presidency, but I think it's just interesting to reflect on what they're going to be leading with in the Leaders Summit. So that's happening Thursday and Friday next week. They're going to be leading with the Belém Declaration on Hunger, Poverty, and People-Centered Climate Action. And this is kind of Brazil's way of trying to join together priorities around poverty and hunger, and then bringing climate action in there. So it's saying that there is no climate resilience without social justice. And social justice means social protection. It means looking after small-scale food producers. It means thinking about a just transition. So it's bringing together what has been Brazil's agenda through the whole presidency of the G20, which was about particularly about poverty and hunger alleviation, and fusing that with the climate agenda. The next thing that they are leading with is this quadrupling of sustainable fuels by 2035. So that's in partnership with the governments of Japan and Italy, and with support from India. And what they're talking about here are biofuels, hydrogen, biogases, and synthetic fuels. So non-fossil fuels, but synthetic fuels are fuels that can be used in those sectors that are very difficult to transition away from fossil fuels. But this raises concerns for people as well, about particularly around biofuels and the land use change that could cause to get this kind of increase in biofuels. The third thing that they're leading with, as Edson mentioned, is the Tropical Forest Forever facility. And that's about treating forests as long-term economic assets and having a mechanism for those investments to generate money which can go to tropical forest countries and to forest stewards, including Indigenous peoples and local communities. Apologies that I was speaking too fast. But when we zoom out from, this is what Brazil is going to present in the Leaders Summit. When we zoom out, we can see that there are gaps across 4 major areas at least. And those are finance, adaptation, emissions, and nature, forests, and food. And so I'd like to briefly touch on those before I invite our Indigenous leaders to respond with their priorities. So in each of these areas, COP30 is trying to address these gaps both across the negotiations and the action agenda. And as I mentioned, the action agenda is the non-state actors. So it's the subnational governments, civil society, business and industry. There is a danger because the action agenda cannot take the place of the negotiations. It's not legally binding in the same way. But what Brazil have done is that they've gathered together the huge number of initiatives that have happened over the last 10 years. So that's 300 initiatives that are still going on. And they've tried to align them thematically with pillars and objectives and formed what they're calling activation groups. And those activation groups are then responsible for pushing that particular objective forward. So, for example, the Shandia initiative from the Global Alliance is part of one of these activation groups. And you can see more. I think there's a really strong opportunity for Indigenous organizations to participate in those groups and have their voices be much louder within the action agenda. As we know, COP is really not just one event, but it's a whole set of layers like an onion. And so alongside the negotiations and the action agenda, we have the pavilion and side events, we have the green zone, we have the mobilizations and the public and media conversations and campaigns. And all of this is important to moving the process forward. So, you know, even if you're not participating in the blue zone or directly in the action agenda, helping to shape the messages that the rest of the world hears about COP. Because even though there will be tens of thousands of people at COP, there are many more people who are interested in it who cannot be there. So what is the message that they are going to hear about what this COP is about, or where the criticism of the COP, as Edson mentioned, needs to land? And people will only go away with one or two ideas about what COP30 is. So it's up to us to shape those messages, and that can be very powerful. Just before I hand over to our Indigenous leaders, I just wanted to touch on some of those areas where COP30 is trying to bridge the gaps and mention some of the key issues at stake. So under finance, there will be negotiation items under Article 9.1 and Article 2.1c. So just to explain what those are, Article 9.1 is about developed countries' obligations to pay developing countries and that transfer of wealth. So following on from the NCQG, which was the financial target decided last year, they'll be looking at how much additional, genuinely new finance is available, how predictable is that finance, how concessional is it, so how low are the rates for lending, and how transparent is it, where it's come from, where it's going to. Under Article 2.1c, it's about aligning the financial flows from different sources. And the discussions there will be how to measure that alignment and also how to look at blockers like fossil fuel subsidies that are distorting the flow of money towards a low carbon economy. At COP30, we'll also see the announcement of the Baku to Belém roadmap to $1.3 trillion. So this came out again from last year from the NCQG negotiations. So Brazil over the past year has been leading these discussions and particularly involving the multilateral development banks and how they can take a bigger role, providing better rates of finance, mobilization of private capital, and creating the right regulatory environment. So this is a very important announcement, but it won't actually be negotiated at the COP. It will be a report that is presented. And then another way of bridging these finance gaps is proposed as the Tropical Forest Forever facility, as I mentioned, an investment tool that will pay tropical forest countries and forest stewards for keeping the forest standing. And Brazil is really leading with this very strongly, even though there are quite a lot of risks associated with this model. It needs to raise a lot of money, $125 billion, in order to be able to generate interest that can then pay tropical forest countries. At the moment, only Brazil and Indonesia have committed to put some funds into that. So COP30 will be waiting to hear, are other countries going to get behind that? Is that a viable model? And will it give the returns that forest stewards, including Indigenous peoples and local communities, Afro-descendant peoples, need to see to be able to look after the forest as they want to? If we can just move on, Axel, to adaptation gaps. On adaptation, this is an issue that has sort of fallen off the priorities a little bit in the last couple of years, and this presidency is very keen to have strong outcomes for adaptation. It has fallen behind mitigation. So mitigation is the reduction in greenhouse gas emissions. Adaptation receives much, much less funding than mitigation, like 5% of international climate finance. At the COP, two important things will come out around adaptation. So the first is about new finance commitments. The goal is to triple finance commitments from developed countries towards adaptation, and also to adopt a set of adaptation indicators, which started as a list of 2,000 or more indicators of progress in adaptation. Now that's down to 100 indicators. And there are some references to Indigenous peoples in those adaptation indicators, but secure land tenure is not one of the indicators. And that's a really missed opportunity to emphasize the role of Indigenous peoples and local communities in stewarding their lands, as Edson spoke about. I also just want to briefly mention loss and damage, which is a separate topic, and actually these are the changes that cannot be adapted to, like either very slow onset events or catastrophic events. But it feels like loss and damage has almost disappeared under adaptation, even though the amount of finance needed for loss and damage is similar or even greater than that needed for adaptation. The fund for responding to loss and damage was established at COP28, and they will be asking for proposals on what to fund this year. We'll also see the full launch of the Santiago network, which is about providing technical assistance around countries experiencing loss and damage. But advocates would really like to see the inclusion of loss and damage in NDCs and a big state of loss and damage report that summarizes why this is such an important area. So those are things that may move forward at COP30. In terms of bridging emissions gaps, Edson has spoken already about the nationally determined contributions, and this is another area where countries are falling short, unfortunately, in their new rounds of NDCs in terms of meeting their climate goals. And we need cuts. We need to see cuts that are 6 to 10 times greater than what is proposed in this round of NDCs. It seems that countries are emphasizing more growing their renewable energy portfolio than they are over reducing their fossil fuel consumption. So there's a big question mark of how will the COP respond to this shortfall, and probably a response needs to appear either in the leaders segment, in a possible cover decision, which is like an overarching document that summarizes items in the COP, or possibly in the GST work stream. I wanted to mention also the Just Transition Work Programme. Edson also spoke about the importance of the Just Transition. And this is an area of negotiations that was set up at COP28 that brings together economic, social, and environmental concerns. So it's how does every economy in the world transition to a low carbon economy in a just manner? And at its best, it should be a forum for equitable, inclusive, rights-based transition. And it's going to be really important to advocate for that at COP30. The Indigenous Caucus has some very clear demands in that area in terms of recognizing FPIC and Indigenous people's right to self-determination, about the negative impacts of the transition, again, as Edson mentioned, that many areas of Indigenous land that are being used for the green transition, either for renewable energies or for mining projects, that Indigenous peoples must be protected from those negative impacts, and particularly Indigenous peoples who are in voluntary isolation and initial contact, that their rights need to be protected, even if they are not discussing these items at the negotiation table. Finally, just before I hand over to our colleagues, I just wanted to talk about the nature, forest, and food gaps. Quite upsettingly, in a way, this COP, even though it's taking place in the Amazon region, it doesn't have as much focus on deforestation as it should have had, and as people would have expected. Almost Brazil, I think, wanted to go out, not have COP30 be known as the deforestation COP. So that means that there are actually quite few dedicated items focusing on deforestation, which was very strongly expressed in the global stocktake. It's we need to halt and reverse deforestation by 2030, and that's only 5 years away. So it's possible that there will be a response to this through the action agenda, but NGOs have also proposed a 5-year action plan for implementation, which brings together all of the different places in the negotiations where deforestation is referenced, to try and create a more unified approach to moving that forward. And that includes considering land rights and tenure of Indigenous peoples and local communities. An area where progress is expected is in the synergies across the Rio Conventions. So that's linking together the Climate Change Convention, the Biodiversity Convention, and the Desertification Convention. So to try and see, ultimately, we're all trying to fight for a world that is livable for everyone and every species, and we should be able to see the places where those strategies link together more effectively. Finally, on nature, forests, and gaps, there will be 3 important commitments. So one is the renewal of the land tenure pledge for Indigenous peoples and local communities, building on the $1.7 billion that was pledged at COP26. Kind of alongside that will be the intergovernmental land tenure commitment, which sets national hectare targets for land tenure, and also providing the support at national level to make that happen. And then the Tropical Forest Forever facility, as we've spoken about already. And none of these are part of the negotiations. So these are commitments that are appearing that countries will be able to sign up to, countries and other entities, but don't bind all parties together in a legal framework like the negotiations do. So just acknowledging the time, and I apologize to my colleagues here, but I would like to invite Basiru Isa from REPALEAC from Cameroon, from Central Africa, and Eustobio Rero and Abdi Akbar from AMAN in Indonesia to open your cameras and join the discussion so that we can have a discussion here together. Thank you. Thanks, Basiru. And
okay. Thank you very much. I don't know whether everyone can hear me.
Yes, we can hear you clearly.
Okay, thank you very much. And good morning, good afternoon, good evening from Brazzaville, from the Congo Basin. And it is an honor for us to join this interesting session, what you called the final sprint to COP30. So as you may know, REPALEAC is fully preparing and also fully preparing and preparing also its participants towards COP30, because we have like a series of 5 demands and also or what we call our priorities for COP. So REPALEAC's key interest at COP30 is, securing stronger recognition and inclusion for indigenous peoples and local communities in Central African forests, governance and climate strategy, and also, globally, because as member of the Global Alliance, we'll also like to seek, like more recognition of Global Alliance and more strategic position of Global Alliance at the global level. So, as you may know, REPALEAC is the network of indigenous peoples and local communities for the sustainable management of forest ecosystem in Central Africa. And REPALEAC plays a vital role in representing grassroots voices across the Congo Basin. Because remember that REPALEAC is made up of over 450 indigenous peoples organizations from the grassroots. It is present in 8 countries with 8 national operational national coordination. So as COP30 approaches, REPALEAC is expected to focus on several strategic priorities that align with both regional and climate goals. These priorities include: 1, there are 5 in numbers. The first one is recognition of indigenous land rights and forest stewardship or forest ownership. REPALEAC during this COP will advocate for formal recognition of indigenous peoples and local community land rights as a cornerstone of climate and biodiversity protection. The Congo Basin is the second largest tropical rainforest, and its preservation depends heavily on the ownership of indigenous peoples and also on local communities. Therefore, COP30 offers a platform for REPALEAC to push for legal framework to secure tenure and prevent land rights or land grabbing or land expropriation. So the second strategic priority for REPALEAC during the COP30 will be direct access to funds, especially the climate funds, what we call usually the climate finance. One of the REPALEAC's strongest demands is equitable access to climate funds. At COP30, REPALEAC will likely call for dedicated funding streams for community-led initiatives, a simplified mechanisms to allow local organizations to apply directly, and also an increased transparency and accountability in fund distribution. And I think this is also like, to inform you that REPALEAC have created their funding mechanism, what we call the REPALEAC Fund. So this aligns with the broader calls from indigenous peoples coalitions worldwide for reforms in how climate finance reaches the ground. The third strategic priority for REPALEAC is the integration of traditional knowledge. And in this regard, REPALEAC will emphasize the value of indigenous ecological knowledge in climate monitoring, in climate adaptation, and in resilience strategies. REPALEAC will seek formal inclusion in national and international climate planning processes, ensuring that traditional practices are not sidelined by top-down approaches. The fourth priority of REPALEAC will be on representation. So REPALEAC will demand for representation in negotiations and decision making. You know, with the largest I just saw the presentation from the cultural our colleague who presented about the large number of indigenous people who will be participating. So with this large number of indigenous delegations expected at COP30, REPALEAC aims to strengthen its presence in negotiation spaces. This will include like participation in official side events and pavilions, engagement with national delegations from Central Africa, and also advocating for observer status and speaking opportunities in key sessions. And finally, REPALEAC will also seek, regional collaboration and visibility. REPALEAC will use COP30 to build alliances across the Amazon, the Congo, and Southeast Asia rainforest, amplifying the voice of forest communities in global climate discourse. They also, REPALEAC also aim to, raise the visibility for Central Africa's unique challenges, such as illegal logging, extractive industries, and climate-induced displacement. So therefore, finally, and we can say that REPALEAC's expectation for COP30 center on justice, inclusion, and empowerment. So REPALEAC will seek not only to be heard, but to shape the decisions that affect their livelihoods, their forests, and their futures. So maybe these are the few words that I can say about the expectations of REPALEAC, or how REPALEAC will deploy itself in COP30. So thank you so much for listening, and I'm available.
Thank you, Basiru, and we will come back, I think, to you with questions. If we can hear from Eustobio and Abdi Akbar from AMAN, and then we can come back with some questions. And please do also feel free, people listening on the call, to put your questions in the chat or under the Q&A tab. Eustobio, thank you so much. Would you like to introduce yourself?
Yeah, sorry, Philip, I speak in Indonesia.
Oh, you're going to speak in Bahasa Indonesia. Okay.
Yeah.
So we will, so please move, if you are wanting to listen in English, please change the channel, and we will it will take a little bit of time because we will have to go from Indonesian to English and English into the other languages. So yes, thank you, Eustobio. Okay.
Right. So for us, Indonesian indigenous people, the most important thing is the recognition of indigenous people's right as the main pillar in the solution on climate crisis. Why? It is because COP30 is the momentum where the government, specifically government of Indonesia, and also international global partner, should recognize the indigenous people's right upon their lands, because that will be the main pillar in overcoming the climate crisis. In the context of Indonesia, our indigenous forest, our indigenous territorials must be legally recognized, must be protected in terms of our land, and it should be managed based on the traditional values of indigenous peoples and legally. I think that is something that we are seeking in COP. And also, we want to build connection between climate action and indigenous people's knowledge. This is essential. Why? Because indigenous people's knowledge serve as the mainstream to strengthen the narrative of sustainable Earth we see COP30 has a different situation. Why? Because the voices in COP30, the voices of indigenous peoples actually better organized and is stronger and recognized. In Indonesia, we continuously consolidate with other NGOs to strengthen the narrative on indigenous peoples and also building strong commitment with the youth and women organizations. We do know that there are still some gaps and challenges in terms of this recognition. However, we are still continuing the effort and to take this COP30 momentum. And looking at the whole COP30 process, the blue zone seems to be the zone where the high-level negotiation and decision-making process is taking place. But we can actually use other zones as well, such as the green zone. This is something that needs to be bridged. And for the existing spaces as well to be used so that the voices of indigenous people can be raised so that we can participate in decision making process, because if we only focus on blue zone only, for example, then what I'm afraid of, we can only result document that is not impactful or without meaning, while we actually able to speak in the agendas of other zones. And the last thing, why we see COP30 as a momentum, it is because this is our chance to talk about the future of indigenous people and the future of the planet. And we are hoping that in COP30, we can strengthen the position of indigenous people as an equal partner in the context of climate governance in Indonesia. For us, the recognition upon indigenous territory should be part of the national climate strategy. On the 28th, there was already some measures taken by the government of Indonesia, a commitment that they are taking in the SBAJ document. The government of Indonesia showed their special attention to accommodate the indigenous people. So we do hope that this COP, in this COP30, indigenous people will not only be seen as stakeholders, but also as right holders and the environment stewards. That is all from me. Thank you, Philippa.
Thank you so much, Eustobio. And I think what you've mentioned there about building alliances between, for example, women's and youth movements and indigenous peoples organizations is so important, that we share many of the same objectives. And also, when we can support each other's voices, then the representation within the negotiation space gets bigger, because everybody is giving the same messages about rights, and not just being stakeholders, but being rights holders and being shapers of the discussion. And we spoke about that in our last briefing with respect to climate finance, that indigenous peoples are shaping the flows of finance, particularly direct finance to territorial funds. It's becoming something that every funder needs to think about as they're designing their programs. I'm interested, you know, for both you, Eustobio, and Basiru, to reflect. What do you hope might be some of the lasting consequences of this COP with a much bigger indigenous presence than ever before? What do you hope that will ensure for future COPs? Maybe Eustobio, you want to respond first.
Okay, so sorry, what was the question again?
The question was, what do you hope might be some of the lasting consequences of this COP, where we have this COP with many more Indigenous people present? How do you hope that will change the process in the future?
Okay, for COP30, I think this is some kind of indicator for us, for the indigenous peoples, because in this scope, this is a momentum for us to build the narratives, the concrete narratives towards the climate change, because we know there are knowledges that became the baseline for us to tackle the climate change. And in the context of Indonesian, we are making sure some some things, particularly that the indigenous peoples are doing their work as the guardians for the forest, and we manage the forest in sustainable ways. But the challenges are we didn't get enough recognition. We are doing so much work to protect our forest. We want some commitment, like Basiru said, for the finance access, the fair finance access, and we want them to be simplified, therefore we can access them. And the note here for the COP30 on how about the loss and damage, the damage, because what we face here is not only about the economy or social aspects, but also the spirituality. And this has been exploited. So, we need the recognition towards this situation that we face as the indigenous peoples. Other than that, I think we know that without the great bridges in each spaces, both in the decision making, in the blue zones or other forums, I think I think there are no commitments that are in the sites on the sites of indigenous peoples. So I think for the hope in this COP30, this could strengthen the position of indigenous people as an allies, as a stakeholder, a right holder, and also the recognition of the indigenous peoples and their territories, because this is part of protection of the earth. And for the net 2030 plans, so I don't want us to be as a stakeholder symbolically, but also we are recognized because we are trying to have solutions to protect the planet. And we hope that indigenous peoples are not only seen as a regular stakeholder, but also the right holders in tackle the climate change.
Yeah, thank you, Eustobio. Basiru, do you want to add anything to what Eustobio has said in terms of what you would like to see at subsequent COPs in terms of indigenous peoples' representation and decision making?
Yeah, thank you so much, and thank you, brother, for raising these issues. I will not come back to what you have said already. COP is like is too big, and at times spaces that are allocated for indigenous peoples are very small. Many indigenous peoples who comes from countries where they have something to present, at times they don't have access to the green zone. So and that is where decisions are being taken. So in REPALEAC, we were trying to see how can we influence so that indigenous peoples can have like a whole or 1 or 2 dedicated days. That is where when we say this is Indigenous Peoples Days, it's not just Indigenous people marching in the streets or what. That is where all leaders can focus, that is dedicate those days for Indigenous peoples. So I think REPALEAC is trying to see how it can work with other organizations like AMAN, like COICA, like AMPB, like APIB, that is within the Global Alliance, and other Indigenous peoples, and also like to see how Indigenous peoples can have like a dedicated day or 2 days within COP. That is first. And second is to see, you know, with our experience with the first Congress that we organized in Congo Brazzaville, you know, we saw how Indigenous people discuss and everything. So I think unless we have a dedicated time for us, unless we have a dedicated attention where everyone will halt everything around COP and listen to Indigenous peoples, our voices will not really be heard at that level. Because today, most governments, most organizations are mostly interested in Indigenous peoples to participate in COP, to participate in their side events, and to participate in panels. But you don't see organizations or governments that are really pressing for Indigenous peoples to participate and influence decisions.
Yeah.
So we think this is very important for us to have to shift from merely participants to part of decision makers in COP, because we want to be in the decision making process, but not in the decision-taking process. Because, you know, when decisions are being made before they are taken. So we are, for now, we are at where, yes, we can participate. So we want to shift the narrative from the decision-taking and climb now where decisions are made. So I think these are the types of initiatives and the new innovations that we want to see in next COPs. Yep.
Yeah, thank you so much. I think it will be really interesting to follow what is happening in Brazil, because they have trained many young Indigenous people as negotiators. So there's a program called Kuntari Kutu that they have been working with in this last year to train these young people to be participants, as you say, in the decision-making process, because otherwise Indigenous peoples are regarded as an observer constituency, and that takes them out of the decision-making spaces. But once they are trained as negotiators and they are in the decision-making spaces, then I think we will start to see a big shift. And just to share a personal desire of mine, I would like to see Indigenous peoples propose a whole wrapper that goes around the Paris Agreement, that is about how we see the Paris Agreement in the context of the world and our relationship to nature, and not to get so tied down in the technical and legal language, which makes the COP very difficult for everybody to understand, you know, but to tell the big story of why this matters. And I feel like Indigenous people would be incredibly well placed to wrap everything up in an Indigenous worldview. If we can just go back to the slides, Axel, and then I will bring in our speakers again to address people's questions. Just in terms of amplifying action at the COP, you know, if you are an Indigenous person going to COP, it's really valuable to join the Indigenous caucus if you can, and to be there at the daily meetings, usually 10 o'clock. They are in the blue zone, and that's the place to start to join working groups on key topics, and then to be able to advocate for the caucus's position, and suggesting text to be included in the negotiations. That's not the only route, but it is one of the important routes. And I've mentioned the action agenda, and you know, even if you're not in the blue zone and in the negotiations, the action agenda is about all of society, and the possibility to then collaborate with other people who want to be allies and who want to push this agenda forward is also much stronger. In terms of bringing your voice and to COP30, you can sign up to the pledges, or the pledge, which is the renewal of the forest and land tenure pledge. You can join an international advocacy campaign, The Answer Is Us, that is being coordinated through APIB, but with many other organizations as well. And on the ground in Belém will be the Indigenous COP happening in the village, and also the People's Summit in the middle of COP at the Federal University of Pará. And that's a much more intersectional, all of society space that will be talking about the challenges and the answers that we can bring. In terms of accessing groundwork, so that's our team, I will be on the ground in Brazil from the 7th to the 14th, and Paula, my colleague, from the 10th to the 18th of November. We will be producing some written briefings that we will send out to our mailing list on day one of the COP, in halfway through and at the end, and that will be specifically focused on issues, priority issues for Indigenous peoples. Please use our WhatsApp channel as well to ask questions, to share the events that you're involved in, and make sure other people know about them. And you can also direct message us through WhatsApp or by email. Great. I'd love to invite all of our speakers back just to deal with some of the questions that people have asked in the chat. So there is a question about media coverage and making speakers available. So maybe Edson, you can talk a little bit about what happens in cultural survival, and Eustobio and Basiru can talk a little bit about how GATC communicates to make sure that these messages are heard.
Thank you, Philippa. Thank you so much for these questions. I have tried to save our time also to answer some of them from my own capacity, typing the answer, but cultural survival with other allies, because it is a type of work we never do it alone. You cannot do it alone. Indigenous peoples are a group of alliances. We have been building these alliances with ourselves, within ourselves, among ourselves, indigenous peoples in plural, because our many, we are very different from the Arctic, from Siberia, from Indonesia, from Philippines, from Brazil, from even the Amazon rainforest. So we have so many different indigenous peoples. We have the Forest Alliance. We have all type of coalitions that can support our work. With that, the cultural survival has been learning that for the last 50 years, how it's important to make friends, to make alliances. I think it is, I appreciate the work you're doing. You, Philippa, and your organization is really expanding the way to do that. I saw you talking to the broad audience to civil society, to indigenous peoples. I appreciate that. I don't want to take for granted, because some organizations, of course, I don't want to complain, but things they only look at their own target groups, and I appreciate you amplifying the scope of interaction. I think this is a solution. Please, everyone is here. Let's amplify our scope of interaction, communication, and building more bridges, the listening to each other. I think it's key for that. So we will be there. Cultural Survival will be especially with a team of advocacy and communications to support indigenous people. We are even offering a group of 3 to 4 interpreters for free for indigenous organizations to talk to media, to talk to journalists, to talk to others if they wanted to go to a bilateral conversation with several languages, French, German, etc., English, of course, the Spanish. They can reach out to us. We will be accommodate their needs and support their work in all our capacity. We are there to support the indigenous people's organizations, and this is one of the ways we are going to do that. Thank you.
Yeah, amazing. Thank you, Edson. Basiru or Eustobio, would you like to talk about how the GATC also gets messages and people into the public conversation? Basiru, you're happy to respond on that?
Hello, please.
Yeah, are you happy to respond about how does the Global Alliance make sure that your voices are heard and part of the public conversation in media coverage and things like that? How do you do that?
Yeah. Okay. You see, we are the GATC. So yeah, we are the GATC. I think we have a strong communication team which is already on the ground working. And I think every organization has a place to, as the GATC global activities, but we also have our member organizations activities that will be done. So I think everything is moving on well in terms of communication. Yep.
Great. Super. One other question that somebody has asked is, could we see, and Eustobio also spoke about this, could we see a similar mechanism happen within the UNFCCC as happened within the CBD process under the Article 8J to have a dedicated subsidiary body on Indigenous peoples in the CBD process? Could we see something similar happen within the UNFCCC? Do you want to share any thoughts on that? To have a more direct role in negotiations. Basiru or Edson or Eustobio, do you want to? Yeah, and somebody in the chat has just mentioned it's for Indigenous peoples and local communities in the CBD process.
Yeah.
Would you like to see something similar be established under the UNFCCC?
Yeah, I think we are already even discussing that, started discussing that in Riyadh. So I think there is an ongoing discussion where focal points are already started being identified. So I just believe that in Belém we will continue the discussions.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Certainly my hope that in this space of looking at the synergies between the conventions, we can also see the mechanisms that are working well in one convention and think about how to bring those into another convention. Because,
exactly.
Yeah, Indigenous peoples and their role in conservation has been much more acknowledged in the CBD process. Eustobio,
Yeah.
did you want to say something about that?
I think there's a lot I think the states have to do for that. Even though I am indigenous and I come from indigenous realities, but I work so close and have so many friends and partners from indigenous, from local communities, traditional communities, forest people. They need more representation. They need to have more access. Indigenous people received way more badges, for example, accreditation opportunities than the local communities. And the states, in some spaces, they are just misusing the local communities, deregulating, not offering ways for them to be recognized as a entity. And we need. I wanted to ask permission to local community friends, brothers and sisters to advocate on their behalf here, say that they need more recognition. They need mechanisms to recognize them as entities in this space, to be part of also of the decision making and decision taking processes, as my friends mentioned before. Because to be honest with you, I will be very direct. Uh, there's a mess, intentionally or not, made by the states about local communities. They are even using that framework to undermine indigenous people's rights, diluting indigenous people's rights. We have the later government in Brazil, the former government of Bolsonaro, and many others. They do this as well, trying to diminish indigenous people's rights as collective rights, and also recognizing local miners, illegal miners, and etc. as a local community. What is local community? The state have to define that, because a civil society cannot be recognized as a local community, because in the cities, for example, they have different priorities. In many cities we go, they even clashing with indigenous peoples and traditional communities agenda. And this is a gap, a huge gap that the states have to address. And we are here to support also traditional communities, quilombola communities, and those local communities in countries that they are fighting for recognition, to support them, because this is a huge legal and political gap that should be addressed to not create more mess, more confusion, more problems in this space. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. And you're highlighting the importance of doing that. This is really a nationally specific issue as well, how communities are configured in each nation state. I wonder if my colleagues in the chat could just put up the link to our short feedback survey. So before I say thank you to all of our participants, I would just like to have, if you can go to this link and just feedback what you feel about this webinar, that would really help us. Thank you, Bahia. Eustobio, I think you wanted to come in on this question of like the Article 8J or some of the other questions that have been asked, and I'd like to give the final minutes of the floor to you if you want to share.
Yeah, I'm thinking the way we work in all conferences need to be effective and efficient, specifically on issues related to indigenous peoples. This is something that we need to discuss. Just like what Basiru said, we need to specifically discuss this in the Indigenous Peoples Caucus on how we can integrate all of the issues. I mean, we are actually talking about the same legal subject, which is the indigenous peoples. In the UNFCCC, talking about climate, in the SB8J, also talks about a lot of diversity. And up until today, there is no integration of all decision-making forums in respective UN meetings. And I believe that the integration is needed, and it needs to be discussed specifically in the Indigenous Peoples Caucus. So that's the first. And then the second, there are actually a lot of narratives that, putting aside, as if just like what the colleague mentioned, that as if that there is a respect to indigenous peoples, yet the practice is very weak. So like us in Indonesia, the extra support or guidance is important post-COP, actually. So although there are commitments by governments during COP, but then after the COP, when they return to their countries, then how will they implement that in the national context? This is something that we need to guard, so that in COP31, we will no longer have commitments that are only on paper without any implementation. So yes, so that will not happen again in the next COP. I think this is something that we need to strengthen in our narrative.
Yeah, thank you so much. The work is never finished. I think is what I hear there. I want to thank all of our contributors today, to Edson Krenak, to Basiru Isa, to Eustobio Rero from AMAN, and to thank our interpreters and the team behind the scenes here at Cinta, my colleague Paula, and to all of you for your attention and for your questions. I'm sorry that we didn't get to all of the questions that you asked, but please join our mailing list, join our WhatsApp group, and you're welcome to continue these discussions there, and also to share the materials from this webinar widely among your own communities and colleagues. So thank you very much. And if you're traveling to Brazil, I wish you safe and smooth travels. I look forward to seeing many people there. Thank you.
Thank you so much, and see you in Brazil. It was very interesting.
Yeah, see you in
See
Belém.
you all soon. Thank you.